the crooked heart of a forgotten hamlet nestled between a monastery that smelled of mildew and a graveyard that smelled of less, stood a squat timber house with a crimson door. No sign hung above the lintel. No flower pots adorned the sill. Only a curious pattern of scratch marks just below the handle, as though those who entered had sometimes tried to claw their way back out. Inside, the air was thick with damp linen, copper, and that sweetly metallic smell, which only ever meant one of two things. Someone had been polishing old coins, or teeth had recently been removed. Now, before we delve deeper into this nightmarish molar menagerie, take a moment, just a moment, to make yourself comfortable. If you're listening, maybe drop a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow descent into historical discomfort. And I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Always fascinating to see which part of the globe is losing sleep to rotting bicuspids tonight. All right, now dim the lights. Perhaps start up a fan for that soothing hum in the background, and let us begin our journey. Try not to clench your jaw. The man who ruled this place was not a barber, nor a doctor, nor a man, if some whispers were to be believed. His name was Willem Krantz, though in most records he is referred to simply as the puller. He didn't pull in the modern sense, of course. He wasn't charming. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't hygienic. But he pulled teeth by the dozen, by the hundreds, in what would later be called Europe's most enthusiastic campaign against dental discomfort. Willem was not licensed. No such things existed in 1324 unless you were performing last rites, and even then, a strong enough voice and a convincing robe could get you pretty far. His tools were humble: a chipped pair of smithing pliers, a bowl of wine vinegar, and a wooden chair with arm straps that suggested this wasn't going to be the kind of appointment one walked away smiling from. At least not immediately. A knock on the door brought a young woman clutching her jaw, her face flushed with the kind of pressure only a swelling gum and absolute dread can produce. She entered. She would not leave the same. Willem ushered her in with a grunt, sniffed the air like a bloodhound, and said in his usual tone, somewhere between monotone and menace, "You've got a weeper, do you?" She nodded. "Aye. Left molar. I can smell it from here." This was no exaggeration. Medieval infections had a tendency to announce themselves a few minutes before the person did. The scent was somewhere between spoiled pork and a dying confession. Willem motioned to the chair, poured a ladleful of the numbing cordial, which tasted suspiciously like vinegar and despair, and began his ritual. No gloves, no gentle assurances, just a prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron of dentistry, irony included, and the sound of rusted steel meeting reluctant enamel. The extraction took 12 minutes. 11 of those involved Willem cursing, the patient shrieking, and the pliers doing their best impression of a blacksmith removing nails from cursed lumber. When it was over, she spat blood into the bucket, collapsed into the arms of a waiting goat herder, her fiancé, allegedly, and left Willem with a molar the size of a baby's knuckle. He turned it in his hand, like a jeweler with a flawed diamond. "Hollow," he muttered. "Could have told you that without all the fuss." He tossed it into a jar, already half full of similar trophies. The label read, in crooked charcoal script, "For trade." That was day one. And if your gums aren't throbbing yet, They will be. There was something about the way the door creaked that morning. Not a casual groan, not the charming protest of old wood warmed by the sun, but a sound with intent, a low, drawn-out shriek that warned, this house eats time and returns pain. No one knocked on Willem Krantz's crimson door lightly. They either pounded in panic or tapped with the kind of hesitation reserved for death sentences. This time it was a slow knock, measured, heavy, as if the knocker already knew what lay ahead, but had made peace with it somewhere between the toothache and the fever dreams. Willem, who had been decalcifying a forceps with a brick and a bottle of goose fat, paused only to grunt. The knock came again. He shouted, downstairs. Chairs free. The house was crooked in all directions. If one were to place a marble on the floorboards, it would roll until it hit a dead mouse or a rotting floor beam, and then change direction on its own. The stairs to the cellar descended at a slant so steep it felt less like walking and more like surrendering to gravity. And yet they came, one by one, crooked soles down, crooked stairs into the waiting cellar. The room was barely more than a pit. Earth walls, a thatch roof above, and a central post to hold back the wrath of collapsing architecture. 3 chairs, uneven, nailed by someone drunk or blind or both, sat in a semicircle. Opposite them stood the operating chair. No cushion, no padding, just splinters and leather straps with more history than comfort. The straps had names carved into them. Some were dates, some were curses, a few were teeth. Today the chairs were occupied by 3 of the village's finest and most miserable. First, old Gret, widow, nearly blind. She'd lost 3 husbands and most of her hearing, but she still had all her teeth. God's punishment, she claimed, so I can suffer them one by one. Next to her, Mikkel, the bell ringer, a man who had been struck by lightning twice and had since developed a tic that caused his head to twitch every time someone said the word tooth. His front incisors were black and wobbled like they were testing gravity. And lastly, a traveler, young, pale, clutching his cheek with a sort of fervent desperation usually reserved for men hiding stolen relics. He refused to give a name, said he had come from the south. His breath smelled like he had brought the plague with him. None of them spoke, not because they were shy, but because speaking made the pain worse. Instead, they nodded to one another in silent fellowship, sufferers in the order of the molar martyrdom. The cellar had no windows, only a small hole near the ceiling that let in slivers of morning light, and occasionally, rats. One of them watched from the beam. Willem called it Squeak, and claimed it was the only assistant he trusted not to faint. Willem descended with the pace of a man unbothered by time. He carried a jug and 3 tin cups. Drink, he said. They drank. The cordial was dark red and bitter, a mixture of wine, clove, opium, and something Willem refused to name. It numbed the tongue and set the stomach twisting. 2 sips, and you forgot the pain. 3, and you forgot your name. 4, and you forgot to breathe. Gret took 2. Mikkel took 3. The traveler refused. I need to remember, he said through gritted teeth. Willem shrugged. Suit yourself. Some folk like to hear their own screams. He motioned for Mikkel. The bell ringer stood, knees trembling, and shuffled toward the chair like a man marching to his own burial. He sat. Willem strapped him in. The forceps clinked as they were selected. Willem muttered a blessing to Saint Apollonia under his breath. Then louder, for theatrical effect. Today, blessed patroness, grant us strength of grip and forgiveness for broken jaws. He grinned at Mikkel. Open. Mikkel opened. The incisor trembled, like it knew what was coming. Willem leaned in, squinting, and pressed the cold iron to the gum. The smell hit first. Metal, meat, and clove. Then the sound, a crack, like splitting firewood. Then the scream. It echoed off the stone like a hymn. The rat bolted. Gret flinched. The traveler clenched his jaw harder. The tooth came out with a wet pop, trailing nerve and a thin string of pus. Willem held it up to the lantern. Rotten clear through, he said cheerfully. Like the soul of a taxman. He dropped it into a clay jar with a clink. Inside, dozens of others waited. Yellow, brown, black, even one gold. Willem said he was building a set of dice. No one dared ask for what game. Mikkel slumped. Alive? Barely. Willem wiped his brow and waved toward the exit. Go rinse with vinegar. Spit in the bushes. Not near my herbs. Next was Gret. She did not speak. She did not flinch. She simply opened her mouth and pointed to a tooth with her crooked finger. Willem raised a brow. You sure? That one's solid, like an old friend. She nodded. He shrugged. Well, let's not betray her trust then. The extraction was less dramatic. The tooth cracked, but did not scream. Gret bled, but did not wince. When it was done, she licked her gums and gave a soft, almost approving grunt. Back in 3 weeks, Willem said. I think you've got one more in you. Then came the traveler. He sat without being asked. Willem looked him over. His eyes were too bright. Fever bright. The kind of brightness that suggests a man is already halfway to the grave and just needs a push. Willem leaned close. You've got a nest in there. I can feel the heat from here. The traveler nodded. Do it. No cordial? No. Willem shook his head. You're brave. Or stupid. The traveler did not respond. Willem braced the jaw, pressed the forceps, and twisted. The scream that followed was not human. It was something older, something elemental. A sound dragged from the roots of suffering and thrust violently into the air like a curse. The tooth fought. It cracked in pieces. Willem dug with an iron hook, pulled shards, spat blood. When it was done, the traveler slumped. Gone, he whispered. Willem nodded. Aye, and half your jaw with it. He wiped his hands. You'll live. Probably. The traveler rose unsteadily and walked out into the light like a ghost freshly unburied. The cellar fell silent once more. Willem sat on his stool and looked at the jar of teeth. He shook it gently. They clinked like coins. He smiled. Outside, the village stirred. The bell tower rang. Chickens clucked. Children chased each other past the red door. Inside, the waiting cellar waited. And somewhere, above it all, a rat returned to its perch, tail twitching in rhythm with a jawless man's footsteps. Tomorrow, the chairs would be full again. Pain never stayed away for long, especially when you were the only man in 50 miles who knew how to turn agony into income. And Willem Krantz was always open for business. There was no official handbook for medieval dentistry, no golden manual passed down from the monks of Salerno, no standardized scroll that declared, thus shall a molar be yanked. Instead, there was Willem Krantz's cabinet, a rickety, beetle-infested armoire that looked as though it might collapse from the sheer weight of regret sealed inside. It stood in the corner of his crooked operating room, opposite the chair of affliction, and was kept locked not for safety, but because the tools inside had personalities. Willem insisted upon it. They remember things, he'd mutter, jangling the iron key around his neck. And some of them hold grudges. The lock clicked open like a sigh, and the doors swung inward with the reverence of a chapel, unveiling a saint's bones. Inside was a chaos that only Willem could navigate. A cathedral of rusted iron, yellowed bone, and stained linen, all arranged not by type, but by temperament. There was no such thing as clean in this room, only familiar filth. He reached first for the pelican, named, not affectionately, after the bird whose bill it resembled. It was heavy in the hand, with two curved beaks forged for gripping a tooth and applying ungodly leverage. The hinges squealed when opened, like they too remembered the screams. Willem liked to whisper to it before use. Be kind, or at least be quick. Next came the tooth key, a cruel little invention that looked like someone had mistaken a wine opener for a surgical miracle. Its clawed end was designed to hook under the tooth, while the handle was twisted, ideally removing the target. Less ideally, it also removed chunks of jaw, cheek, and in one memorable instance, a man's dignity. Willem admired it with the pride of an artist regarding a brush that had painted masterpieces in blood. He gave it a polish with a square of linen that might once have been white. Then there was the scraper, a narrow, jagged piece of steel meant for removing tartar and scraping out the rotted insides of a hollow tooth. Patients often asked if it was a knife. Willem never corrected them. He felt that the ambiguity inspired appropriate fear. The drill was the worst. A bow drill, stolen from a carpenter, slightly modified with a leather thong and a splintered handle. Its bit was dulled from years of dragging through enamel like a plow through stone. Its sound, the low rising whine of steel against tooth, had been described by one former patient as what the devil's violin must sound like when played with a screaming cat. In a jar sat twine, made from catgut, dried and stretched, yellowed by age. It was used for stitching, tying tongues, occasionally improvising braces. Willem said it had once been harvested from a bishop's pet that died during a sermon about humility. Whether that was true or one of his frequent embellishments, no one dared ask. Hanging from pegs were pliers of various sizes, none of them surgical by design. Most were repurposed from blacksmiths or coopers. One pair had notches etched into the handle, 10 of them. Willem claimed each notch marked a successful extraction where the patient didn't faint. The pliers were old. The notches were new. In the lower drawer lay sutures, herbs, and ointments of his own concoction, combinations of crushed rosemary, burnt sage, and thick paste made of vinegar and charcoal. He would pack these into sockets post-extraction with a wooden stick, muttering something that sounded like prayer, but tasted like punishment. And lastly, his pride, a set of false teeth, carved from ivory, smoothed to an eerie sheen. They were held together with twisted wire and a great deal of overconfidence. Willem had made them for himself years ago, when a particularly hostile widow had shattered 3 of his original teeth with a candlestick. He wore the dentures when drinking with the mayor or intimidating patients who hesitated at the door. When he smiled with them, they gleamed like trophies from someone else's mouth. The tools were not cleaned often. They were seasoned, as Willem put it, like a good skillet or a bad memory. When a new apprentice once dared to boil them, Willem fired him on the spot and tossed the instruments in a sack of ash to reclaim their personality. Above the cabinet, nailed crookedly into the beam, hung a sign that read, Salvatio per dolor, salvation through pain. Willem claimed it came to him in a dream, delivered by the ghost of Saint Apollonia herself, who gently tugged out one of his dream teeth while whispering, they must bleed to be reborn. He woke up that night screaming, and according to the tavern keeper next door, grinning. The tools weren't just instruments. They were characters in his theater. The pelican was the brute, the tooth key the rogue, the scraper the interrogator. The drill? That was the executioner. And the cabinet was the gallows where they all waited, silent, gleaming, and hungry. Patients didn't see this side. When they walked into Willem's cellar, they saw the chair first, then the man, and only then, the tool. By that point, most had resigned themselves to the agony. They were ready to sacrifice the tooth. The question was whether anything else would go with it. Blood, bone, perhaps a small portion of soul. The tools never left the room. Willem believed that taking them outside would dilute their spirit. Once, during a village fair, the mayor had asked Willem to set up a demonstration booth for education. Willem refused. These instruments are sacred, he said, and besides, the sun off the metal makes people vomit. No one pressed further. Once a month, during the new moon, Willem polished them by candlelight, naked to the waist, chanting words that sounded vaguely Latin, but were mostly gibberish. He claimed it kept them loyal. Last thing I need, he explained, is a pelican that slips when I'm sober. There was one instrument he never used. It was a pair of gold-plated pincers, slender and ornate, with delicate filigree along the handles, and a tip so fine it could split a human hair. They sat in a velvet-lined box at the bottom of the cabinet, untouched. Willem claimed they had been gifted to him by a dying cardinal who wanted one last tooth removed with dignity. Willem took the gift and then used the regular pliers anyway. The golden ones, he said, were too smug. Visitors often ask about them. Ah, Willem would say, those are for my retirement. No one ever laughed at that joke, mostly because the idea of Willem Krantz retiring implied that pain might one day rest, and no one truly believed that. Once, a patient, a traveling scholar from the university, made the mistake of commenting on the state of the tools. He had come for a simple molar extraction, and upon seeing the pelican, had muttered, "Is that not a butcher's tool?" Willem paused. "Aye," he said, "but isn't every healer a butcher in the end?" Then he pulled the tooth without warning. When the scholar woke, jaw throbbing and eyes watery, he found a tooth wrapped in linen beside him. A note pinned to it read, "You were right." Willem never charged him. In truth, Willem believed the tools were what separated him from the rest. Any drunk could swing a mallet and pop a tooth, but only he had built a church of suffering. Only he had forged communion through extraction. To him, the tooth wasn't the problem. It was the key. Every rotting root, every crumbling molar, was a confession waiting to be drawn from the skull. The instruments were his relics, his apostles, his orchestra, and when they sang, when iron met enamel and pain blossomed into the open air, it was, in Willem's view, the closest thing this world would ever get to divine music. The cabinet was closed, with a soft thud. Locked. The tools were sleeping now, their hunger sated for the day. Above, the church bells rang the hour. Patience stirred on the stairs. More would come. They always did. And the instruments would be waiting. The human mind when faced with overwhelming agony, will reach for anything to avoid acknowledging it. Faith, denial, herbs, wine, even interpretive dance, if it must. Willem Krantz knew this well. He had once tried to extract a tooth from a miller who managed to hum a lullaby through the entire process, never screaming once. Afterward, Willem offered him a job. "You want to assist me?" he'd asked. "I'd rather eat ash," the man had replied. Still, the lesson stuck. Pain, while sovereign, could be distracted. Not conquered, not truly, but nudged politely to the side like an unwanted guest at a feast. And so, Willem built his distractions accordingly. Just enough theater to make the bleeding seem less personal. It began with the cordial, which wasn't so much a drink as it was a compromise between poison and mercy. The recipe changed depending on what Willem had in his garden or what had recently died in his pantry. But the core ingredients remained. Wine thick enough to coat the throat, clove oil for numbing, henbane for dreams, and the barest touch of poppy for everything else. Some batches turned men into giggling fools. Others turned them silent and pale as tombstones. One batch turned a widow into a baritone for 3 days. Willem didn't test his potions before use. That would have been wasteful. After the cordial came the smoke, which he considered his greatest innovation since discovering that sheep wool could be used to wipe blood without leaving fibers behind. The smoke was a blend of herbs, mosses, and things he never named, burned slowly in a hollowed-out jawbone, set atop coals. It created a thick, fragrant fog that filled the cellar and blurred the corners of the world. You didn't need to believe in magic for it to work. You only needed to be desperate. Patients would breathe it in through their mouths, eyes watering. While Willem began his work, the smoke dulled the sharp edges of reality. It made the pelican seem less like a torture device and more like a misunderstood bird. It made the scraping feel distant, like hearing your own scream through a closed window. But of course, some people required more. For the noble class, those who came with rings on their fingers and family crests embroidered into their cloaks, Willem offered the pipes, long, thin bamboo tubes through which he would blow sweetened vapor directly into the nostrils. These he called Apollonia's kiss, and he charged a silver groat for each puff. Nobles loved it. They claimed it made them feel ascended, as though angels were combing their gums with silken threads. In truth, it mostly made them pass out, which was far more convenient. Sometimes they woke up with a tooth missing and a bill tucked into their sleeve. One baroness awoke mid-extraction and tried to stab Willem with a hatpin. He removed her last 3 molars free of charge as an apology. She later recommended him to her sister. For children, Willem had different tactics. He hated working on them. Their mouths were small, their screams pitched too high, and they had an irritating habit of asking, "Will it hurt?" as though the answer ever changed. But they came, dragged by mothers or aunts, or occasionally priests who swore the devil had taken residence in a bicuspid. To soothe them, Willem introduced the monkey. He found it at a market, half-starved and wearing a sailor's hat. He named it Tibbles. Tibbles was trained to play a small tambourine and hop in circles while Willem worked. The children laughed. The adults laughed. Even the monkey laughed, though whether from joy or gas-induced hysteria was never clear. One day, Tibbles bit a bishop. Willem replaced him with a mechanical rat, built by a tinkerer who owed him 3 teeth. The rat had bells on its back, and would spin in circles when wounded. It wasn't quite the same, but it didn't bite clergy, which was considered an improvement. There were other diversions too. Paintings on the ceiling, grotesque angels with too many wings, saints holding teeth like relics, a cherub vomiting clove leaves into a goblet. Willem claimed they were meant to inspire contemplation. Most patients just stared at them to avoid eye contact with the drill. Music, sometimes. A dusty hurdy-gurdy in the corner, played by an apprentice with only 3 fingers. The songs were slow, dissonant, and deeply unsettling. One tune in particular seemed to follow the rhythm of the extraction process. Scrape, grind, snap, silence. And then there were the stories. Willem loved to talk. He'd spin tales while working, usually beginning with, "Did I ever tell you about the time?" and ending in something vile. He spoke of barons who kept their lovers' teeth on chains, monks who filed their molars to better chew flagellation whips, and of one queen who had a golden fang she sharpened before war. Once, mid-extraction, he told the story of a man who faked his own toothache to avoid marriage, only to be caught and dragged to Willem for treatment. The moral of the tale was unclear, but it ended with the man screaming and Willem cackling. Patients found it oddly comforting. Sometimes, the distractions worked too well. One woman became so intoxicated by the cordial and the smoke and the music that she proposed marriage halfway through a root canal. Willem declined, citing professional ethics. She returned 3 months later for another attempt. This time, he extracted a wisdom tooth and gave her a polite no. In truth, all of this, the smoke, the monkey, the ceiling art, was less about kindness and more about control. Willem understood that fear was like a second infection. If it festered, it made everything worse. It made the blood flow faster, the jaw clench harder, the memories cut deeper. So, he offered distractions, not as mercy, but as manipulation. Make them laugh, make them curious, make them drowsy, but above all, make them forget what's coming. The instruments, he believed, were honest. They did not lie. They did not promise comfort. But the distractions? The distractions were the velvet curtain over the Iron Maiden. They gave you a moment of peace before the plunge. Still, not everyone responded the same. There were those who resisted every trick. Farmers with fists like anvils, who refused the cordial, stared down the pelican, and dared Willem to get on with it. One even bit the scraper in half and spit it on the floor. Willem respected them. He also charged them double. Then there were the screamers, those whose fear erupted into pure noise, the kind of shrieks that peeled plaster off the walls. For them, Willem used the gag, a wooden wedge carved from yew and soaked in vinegar. It kept the mouth open and the tongue out of the way. It also muffled the sound somewhat, though the vibrations still rattled the windows. One night, during the storm, lightning struck the building just as a patient let out a particularly operatic howl. The combination of thunder and terror caused 2 chickens to drop dead outside. Willem took it as a sign of divine approval. Despite all these horrors, people kept coming, not because they liked it, not because it didn't hurt, but because Willem Krantz, for all his sadism and smoke, could fix things. They left bleeding, shaking, occasionally short a few memories, but they left without the pain that brought them. And sometimes, in the strange hush of post-extraction clarity, they even thanked him. Willem never smiled at that. He believed in pain. He believed in blood. But he didn't believe in gratitude. He kept a wall of thank you notes anyway. Scribbled parchments, crumpled letters, even a poem someone once wrote about the man with the blessed wrench. They were pinned beside the mechanical rat and Tibbles' sailor hat. A shrine, perhaps, or a joke. In the end, all the smoke, all the spirits, all the lovely distractions, they were his tools, just as much as the tooth key or the drill, only softer, only stranger. And on certain nights, when the wind howled just right and the smoke curled in perfect rings, Willem would sit back, sip his own cordial, and say to the darkness, "They'll forget the pain until it comes again." And it always did. No one ever truly wanted to write about their visit to Willem Krantz. Those who survived preferred to pretend it hadn't happened, like a dream you wake up from sweating, but never mention to your spouse. The pain was too fresh, the blood too vivid, and the lingering taste of vinegar and iron far too real. And yet, in one of the many damp drawers beneath the surgical cabinet, Willem kept a collection of documents. He called it the archive. Others might have called it a crime scene. It was an assortment of crumpled letters, fragments of parchment, and entire journals left behind by patients who either forgot them or never returned to claim them. Willem did not throw these away. He read them by candlelight, late at night, with the same reverence a priest might offer scripture. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he muttered, "Exaggeration," under his breath. But mostly, he just nodded along, as though reliving every tooth and scream personally. The most complete of these was the journal of Brooks of Dornfeld, a parchment seller who had developed an abscess the size of a goose egg under his jaw. Brooks had arrived on a Tuesday, staggering through the rain like a man carrying an invisible boulder. He had been unable to speak, only moan. He stayed in the cellar for 12 days. His journal began the night before his first procedure. Day 0. My jaw is thumping like a war drum. My right eye weeps without reason. I can no longer chew, smile, or speak to my mule without spitting blood. Tomorrow, I seek out the puller. They say he has a monkey that dances. I hope it dances over my grave. On the first day, Willem lanced the swelling. Brooks wrote, Day 1. The pain was exquisite. He used a curved knife that smelled of ham fat. The pus burst like a wine bladder. I saw stars, possibly saints. Brooks had a habit of poetic description when delirious. According to his entries, he hallucinated during nearly every procedure. Once he claimed to see a woman made of beeswax who offered to replace his teeth with pearls if he agreed to give up his tongue. He refused, and Willem pulled another molar. Day 4. He called it the widow's tooth, said it had a crooked root like a broken promise. It came out sideways. I wept and sang a song I haven't heard since childhood. Willem read that entry aloud once and remarked to his apprentice, He's got talent. Might have made a fine bard if his face weren't imploding. By day 6, Brooks could barely eat. His entries grew fragmented. Day 6. The cordial no longer helps. I see the monkey even when it isn't there. It claps without sound. Willem says it's the best patient he's had all week. Day 7. He drilled today. I felt it in my dreams. I dreamt I was a bell tower, and someone rang me until I cracked. On day 9, Brooks began referring to the tools by names. He called the pelican Sister Beak. He called a scraper the Whisperer. He called a forceps Regret. Day 9. Sister Beak kissed my gums again. She left a gift. Blood, as always. I no longer recognize my mouth in the mirror. I suspect I am becoming something else. Willem had not intended to keep Brooks so long, but the parchment seller insisted. Every time he tried to leave, something would fester. A socket would swell. A fever would spike. Willem began to suspect the man was rotting from the inside out, one layer at a time. Brooks's final entry was written in a shaky hand. Day 12. I heard the door open last night. The tools were whispering. Not to me, to each other. They're tired. So am I. If I don't wake tomorrow, let this serve as testament. The puller took my pain, and most of my dignity, but he left me alive longer than I deserved. Brooks died the next morning. Not from the procedures, not exactly. A clot had formed in his throat and ruptured while he slept. His body was found slumped against the cellar wall, mouth open in a crooked smile. Willem, ever pragmatic, billed the next of kin for lodging and final extraction. Brooks's journal remained in the archive. It was not the only one. There were also pages torn from a noblewoman's travel diary, splashed with blood and cordial stains, where she described Willem as half doctor, half demon, all efficiency. There was a scrap from a child's notebook, no older than 7, where the words, "He took my tooth," were written 10 times in crooked, tear-blurred ink. And there were poems, bad ones. "Oh, puller, cruel and wise, your chair holds truth behind its lies. You grip my jaw, my soul, my sin, and leave a hole where once had been." Willem loved that one. He recited it often, usually while flossing with horsehair. One entry, unsigned, was written on the back of a tax receipt. "It is not the pain I remember most. It is the silence between instruments, that breath between the scraping and the pulling. In that moment, I could hear my heartbeat arguing with itself." Some entries were confessions. A merchant from the southern coast admitted, while drunk on cordial, that he had poisoned his wife's soup. He said the guilt festered in his jaw. Willem pulled 3 teeth. The man wept, kissed the forceps, and left without paying. An old nun wrote that her toothache was penance. She had lied to a bishop. About what? She did not say. Willem did not ask. He extracted the tooth and whispered, "Absolution granted," just to see her cry. Willem never judged his patient's words. He wasn't a priest. He was a puller. But he liked the way pain made people honest. He sometimes wondered what he would write in his own journal. Day 3200. The tools are restless again. I polish them with salt. They gleamed like saints. The monkey is dead. The rat has arthritis. But the chair holds. He would never write it, of course. That would be sentimental. Instead, he added to the archive. When a patient mumbled through a blood-clogged mouth, he listened. When they confessed things no one else would ever hear, he nodded. And when they died, and sometimes they did, he took whatever was left in their pockets and sorted it between useful and worth reading. Some days, he read for hours. He'd sit beside the hearth, poring over pages, while the tools soaked in vinegar. He'd chuckle, wince, or shake his head. "This one," he said once, holding up a letter with dried tears. "This one gets it." And when new patients arrived, he didn't warn them. He didn't say, "Others came before you and wept the same." He simply offered the cordial, gestured to the chair, and began again. Because that was the truth Willem understood better than most. Pain passed, teeth fell, but stories remained. And if you listened closely, late at night, when the wind scraped against the shutters and the cellar breathed beneath the boards, you could almost hear the archive whispering back, The year the plague arrived, the village didn't so much fall into chaos as it slumped into it like a drunk into a ditch, slow, wet, and far too familiar. The rats had been there first. Of course, they always were. Willem Krantz had long suspected that the rodents in his cellar knew more about the future than the priests did. They left 3 days before the first corpse twitched. It started with a cough, then a boil, then another, then black spots, swelling lymph nodes, and finally, a frantic knocking on his red door from people who had never thought to come before. Not for a tooth, not for anything. They didn't come for extractions now. They came because their mouths had turned into monuments of rot and pus, because their tongues had swollen like overripe figs, and because chewing bread caused nosebleeds. Whatever the plague touched, it left behind trembling gums and shattered molars. Willem was not surprised. Pain, he said, always finds a way in through the mouth. He adjusted. He adapted. While priests were burning herbs and monks were dying in heaps, Willem Krantz was sterilizing his forceps in the flames of a plague pyre and boiling linen wraps in vinegar strong enough to make your eyes itch from 3 streets away. He didn't fear the Black Death. He respected it. He began to wear a mask, not one of those long-beaked monstrosities others used, but a tight-fitting cloth soaked in camphor and sewn shut with horsehair. The mouth was covered, the eyes left bare, and a line of cloves stitched along the collar. He looked like a butcher preparing for high mass. Patients began arriving in droves, not just the desperate, but the superstitious. They'd heard rumors that pain could be purged from the body if the offending tooth was removed before the fever peaked, that rot in the soul could be lanced through the gums, that Krantz somehow was immune. This last point was not entirely false. Willem didn't get sick. He didn't sneeze, didn't cough, didn't sweat. Theories varied. Some believed he'd died long ago and hadn't noticed. Others claimed his blood was mostly vinegar by now. One man said Willem had kissed the arse of death himself and found it lacking. Whatever the case, Willem kept working. He treated them all. Nobles and beggars, thieves and tailors, monks and midwives. They came wheezing, blistered, smelling of sour meat, and left lighter by a tooth or two. Most died anyway, some within the hour. A few even died mid-extraction. He kept a ledger of these, not for money. Plague work was mostly paid in bread and tears, but out of interest. A scientific curiosity, he said. The ledger had columns for age, profession, number of boils, and whether or not the extraction seemed to ease their final breath. Page after page. Died during scraping. Died after cordial. Died after singing. One entry simply read, sneezed, then silence. Of course, working on plague victims meant precautions. He began soaking his hands in spirits before and after every patient. He demanded silence during procedures. Any cough might carry more than air. He sealed off the cellar and operated by lantern light and instinct. But it wasn't enough. One morning, his apprentice, a sharp-eyed boy of 16, named Len, failed to arrive. Willem found him curled on the straw bed upstairs, purple blotches blooming across his neck, mouth full of blood, and teeth loosened, as if death had tried to yank them himself, and lost interest halfway through. Willem stood over him for a while. Then he took the boy's molars, 2 of them, and placed them in a tiny glass vial, labeled L. He added the vial to a shelf full of similar jars, a shelf most people never saw. He worked alone after that. The plague changed things. The blood ran darker. The The screams when they came were shorter, cut off by ruptured lungs or seized throats. Some patients didn't scream at all. They just stared, glassy-eyed, while Willem worked as if they were mannequins. Once, he extracted 7 teeth from a merchant who never blinked once during the procedure. He died an hour later, smiling. The tools responded strangely. The pelican began to rust around the beak, not from moisture. Willem checked carefully, but as if it had grown weary. The tooth key developed a squeal Willem couldn't file out. The drill, worst of all, began to stick. It would pause mid-turn, as if waiting for something or someone. Willem spoke to them more often, not loudly, just small mutterings between extractions, encouragement, apologies, warnings. One night, while cleaning the cabinet, he found a note folded inside the velvet pouch that held the golden pliers. It wasn't his handwriting. Leave them be. You're not meant to save everyone. He didn't know who had written it. The door had been locked, the cellar sealed. He burned the note. Then he extracted 5 more teeth before dawn. Among his many patients was a priest, young, trembling, with a lesion under his tongue, and a crucifix gripped so tight it left indentations in his palm. He asked Willem to pray with him before the extraction. "I'm not a priest," Willem said. "No," the man whispered. "But you're closer to God than most of us right now." Willem stared at him for a moment, then nodded. He recited a half-remembered benediction from childhood. The priest wept. Then he screamed as the molar came loose, trailing pus like a comet. He died the next day. Willem kept the crucifix. It hangs by the cabinet now, beside the jars. There was one case he never forgot. A young girl, no older than 10, brought in by her mother. Boils on her arms, blood at the corner of her mouth, and breath so foul it made even Willem flinch. The mother begged him to do something. Anything. "She's all I have." He examined the girl. One tooth was blackened. The rest were loose. Her gums bled without provocation. He considered saying no, but the look in the mother's eyes made him set the tools on the table anyway. He pulled the blackened tooth. The girl cried softly, but didn't resist. He packed the socket with herbs, wrapped her jaw, and told the mother to boil everything twice. 3 days later, the girl returned. She was walking, breathing easier. The boils had faded. Her gums had stopped bleeding. She smiled. A smile with one less tooth, but a smile all the same. Willem said nothing, just nodded. As they left, he muttered to himself, "Sometimes the plague misses." He recorded it in his ledger. Survived. Left smiling. That page is still marked with a wax seal. When the plague finally moved on, as all monsters eventually do, the village emerged like survivors of a shipwreck, bruised, scarred, and unwilling to speak of what had washed over them. Willem didn't change. He cleaned the tools. He re-oiled the hinges. He bleached the straps on the chair and repainted the red door. He stitched a new curtain across the cellar entrance. People began coming again, slowly, quietly, not with boils, but with cracked molars, aching jaws, and the dull daily misery of being alive. They didn't mention the plague, neither did he. But sometimes, at night, when the wind passed through the rafters, just right, Willem could swear he heard coughing beneath the floorboards. Not real, of course, just memory, and he would whisper, to no one in particular, "Pain always finds a way back." Then he'd unlock the cabinet. The tools would glint in the lantern light, and the chair would creak stretching in anticipation, as though it too remembered what it meant to be needed. By the time the black banners were pulled from the rooftops and the smell of funeral smoke gave way to spring blossoms, Willem Krantz had become more than a man. He was an institution, a fixture, a necessary evil, with a red door and a ledger full of screams. People no longer whispered his name with fear. They whispered it with necessity, the same way you whisper about weather, or taxes, or death. It was in this strange, post-plague lull, when everyone walked a little softer and bit a little more carefully, that Willem had an idea. He was sitting by the hearth one night, cleaning his pelican with a strip of salted goat hide, when it occurred to him he was overworked, not exhausted, not incapable, just surrounded by mouths and short on hands. The backlog of toothaches stretched for weeks. The line outside his cellar, some mornings looked like a sermon, was being held in reverse. And the truth was, not every molar needed the master's touch. Some mouths, he reasoned, could be left to others. And thus, with the precision of a man filing an incisor to a point, Willem founded the Guild of Grinders. Its mission was simple: to expand the reach of oral agony across the region, under the noble banner of Willem's method. Not healing, not comfort, not relief. No, the Guild would offer resolution. Quick, cruel, and unmistakably effective. Membership was selective. Willem didn't trust just anyone with forceps. Barbers were obvious recruits. They already knew how to hold blades and ignore screaming. Blacksmiths made good candidates too. Their grip was steady, their hands were calloused, and they weren't afraid of a little blood. Butchers were welcomed with open arms. They had a gift for separating flesh from bone and no particular attachment to subtlety. Each applicant had to pass the test. Not a written exam, of course. Willem had no patience for ink and grammar. No, the test was practical. Each would-be grinder was given a pig's head, usually borrowed from the local slaughterhouse, and a selection of Willem's less loved tools. The task was to remove 4 teeth in under 15 minutes with minimal splintering. Those who succeeded were handed a corded necklace bearing a single molar dipped in beeswax. Those who failed were told to stick to shaving necks or hammering nails. The guild's first meeting was held in Willem's cellar. 4 men and 1 woman, all sitting on crates, all sipping from the same cordial-filled jug. Willem stood at the head of the room, like a priest ready to distribute communion. Only his chalice held pliers, and his gospel was pain. He laid down the code, scratched onto a goat-hide scroll with blood ink and great fanfare. Article 1. A grinder shall extract, not entertain. Distraction is a tool, not a requirement. Article 2. All 5th teeth extracted are property of the guild for research, ornament, or barter. Article 3. Any grinder found using false cordial or dull instruments shall be fined 3 groats and publicly mocked. Article 4. Disputes over territory must be settled via dental duel. Pliers at dawn, judged by Willem himself. Article 5. No member shall remove a tooth from a patient already missing more than 12, unless the patient insists or payment is doubled. The new grinders swore their oaths over a basin of soot and spit. The basin was later placed on a shelf and named the Chalice of Pain. No one questioned it. The guild grew quickly. By summer, there were 15 grinders operating across the region. Some worked out of carts, some from converted stables, one even from a former confessional booth in a church no longer in use. unless one counts screaming as a form of repentance. They developed symbols: a crimson molar painted on a signpost, a belt with plier loops, a pin in the shape of a cracked bicuspid. It became common, even fashionable, to say you'd had a guild pull, rather than some back alley hack job. The guild had standards. The guild had rules. But more than anything, the guild had stories. There was the tale of old Bartram, a grinder who accidentally pulled the wrong tooth, gave the patient a chicken as apology, and then married the man's daughter a month later. There was Mira the Red, the only female grinder in the first 5 years, who operated with bare hands and no assistant. She used a dagger to loosen molars and had a tattoo of a tooth on her left cheek. Children were terrified of her. She offered lollipops after every procedure, as if to balance the cosmos. And then there was Thrain the Tallyman, who recorded every scream on a set of knotted cords. He claimed the longer the scream, the more effective the treatment. Patients disliked him, but his success rate was unmatched. Willem watched it all with pride and mild horror. He hadn't expected success. He had expected chaos. But pain, it turned out, was a solid foundation on which to build an empire. He hosted annual gatherings in a rotting barn near the edge of the forest. Each grinder brought a story, a tooth, and a bottle. The stories were shared around a fire, the teeth added to a growing mound beneath an old oak, and the bottles emptied without ceremony. One year, Willem introduced the Golden Gum Award, given to the grinder with the cleanest extraction and the least blood spilled. The prize was a gold-painted canine and a round of applause. The winner that year was a man who'd extracted 6 teeth from a bishop's mouth without waking him. The guild also produced treatises, scrawled manuals passed from hand to hand, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes stitched into coat linings. Titles included On the Efficiency of Curved Beaks versus Straight Claws in Root Retrieval, Screaming as a Measure of Precision, A Theoretical Rebuttal, The Philosophical Tooth, What Lies Beneath the Enamel. Willem claimed he never read them, but sometimes, late at night, he could be seen muttering phrases like occlusal, supremacy, under his breath while grinding herbs. Not everything went smoothly, of course. There were incidents. A grinder in the north tried to offer musical accompaniment, bagpipes, during extractions. He was chased out of town by a flock of geese and never seen again. Another claimed he could pull teeth with magnetism. His patients left with headaches, one missing ear, and several new suspicions about science. And then there was the schism. A young grinder named Varen began promoting pain-free dentistry. He used chilled spoons, soft music, and calming herbs. He refused to strap patients down. He offered hugs. Willem was incensed. Pain, he barked during an emergency guild meeting, is not the problem. It's the process. Without pain, they forget. Without fear, they rot. Varen was expelled. His tools were confiscated. His name struck from the rolls. He opened a rival practice 2 towns over, called it the Gentle Jaw. It burned down a week later. No one was charged. Willem claimed to have been home the whole night, reading a poem about enamel erosion. As years passed, the guild became legend. Children dared one another to sneak into a grinder's tent. Ballads were written, bad ones, usually sung drunk. And in the village, Willem's red door remained, untouched by dust, eternally ajar. He was no longer alone. He had disciples, he had imitators, he had rivals. But more than anything, He had respect, and when a patient came to him, jaw trembling, hands sweating, and asked, "Are you the original?" Willem would smile, just slightly, and reply, "I'm the reason the others use straps." Then he'd open the cabinet. The tools would gleam, the air would thicken, and another tooth would join the cause. There were places even pain hesitated to enter, rooms too soaked in centuries of rot and whispers, where teeth weren't just removed, they were offered. The deeper you went into certain hamlets, the less people talked of dentistry, and the more they spoke of rituals, bargains, and the quiet things done in basements lined with candle wax and jawbones. Willem Krantz never advertised himself as a spiritual man. His God was function, his gospel, the hinge of a well-worn pelican. But even he understood that pain, over time, began to resemble religion. And like all religions, it bred ritual. It began innocently enough. A mother once asked if her son's baby teeth could be buried beneath the yew tree behind his house. Said it would ensure the rest of his teeth grew straight. Willem shrugged. "They'll rot just the same underground as in my cabinet," he said, and handed her the teeth in a cloth pouch. A week later, she returned, son in tow, bright-eyed and full of pride. "Look at his smile," she beamed. "No pain, no swelling, not even a sore gum." Willem was unconvinced. Coincidence. Natural healing. The boy probably just hadn't chewed on any bricks recently, but he made a note of it in his personal ledger. Burial under yew. Anecdotal success. Soon after, others came with requests. Could he say a word before the extraction? Could he light a candle? Could he draw a symbol on the tooth before removal? Willem balked. "Do you want me to pull it or bless it?" He snapped at a fisherman who had asked him to tie a red thread around his incisor first. But the requests didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. People weren't just coming for treatment anymore. They were coming for protection. From pain, from infection, from whatever shadowed thing lurked behind their gum line and whispered in the night. So, Willem adapted, grudgingly. He introduced the coin tap. A copper penny struck against the affected tooth 3 times before extraction. Some said it confused the evil spirits living inside the enamel. Others claimed it simply dulled the pain. Willem liked it because it made the patients flinch early, and that gave him a better grip. Then came the chant, not Willem's invention. A farmer brought it to him, mumbled it through a swollen cheek as the cord soaked into his tongue. It went, "Tooth of mine, take my pain, leave my flesh, and don't remain. Through the pull and through the cry, let my sorrow rot and die." It rhymed, badly, but it stuck. Willem heard it repeated in 5 villages before the month was out, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in song, once scrawled in blood on his cellar wall after a particularly dramatic patient expired mid-procedure. Willem started offering ritual bundles. He never called them that, of course. He referred to them as comfort accompaniments. A bundle included a clove-scented candle, a small bone charm shaped like a molar, and a strip of linen with the chant printed in shaky ink. He charged 3 times the cost of the actual extraction. They sold out. But the real shift came with the storms. A thunderhead rolled through the region one spring and didn't leave for 3 days. Rain came in sheets. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning licked the steeples of churches until they wept soot. During those nights, people came to Willem's door in record numbers, pale and urgent, clutching their jaws like sinners about to confess, they claimed the lightning made their teeth hurt, that each strike felt like it split their skulls in half, that the pain only eased when they pressed their face to the ground. Willem scoffed until he felt it himself. It came as a throb behind his remaining molars, a pressure that buzzed like bees inside his bone. The pelican, resting on the table, seemed to vibrate. Even the chair creaked at random intervals, as though it too were unsettled. He pulled 13 teeth in one night, 11 from people, 2 from himself. After that, the storms became holy. Superstition spread like mold. Villagers said that extractions during lightning would purify the soul, that the thunder scared demons from the root, that if you held a coin under your tongue while the tooth was pulled, your children would be born without pain. Willem didn't argue anymore. He simply raised his prices when the clouds rolled in. He adopted storm rites. Drapes soaked in wine vinegar were hung across the windows. A bowl of river stones was placed beneath the chair. Each patient was asked to spit once into a basin before the procedure, and once after. If the second spit was darker, it meant the evil had fled. Willem recorded the patterns. There were variations. Some patients demanded their extracted teeth be burned immediately in a brazier outside. Others insisted the tooth be left beneath a running stream. One woman brought a cage of sparrows and released one with each tooth removed. Willem never asked where she got so many birds. Then came the bone garden. Not Willem's idea either. A man named Elias began planting his family's teeth behind his house, arranging them in spirals. Claimed it was an old tradition from the eastern hills, though no one knew what hills he meant. Flowers began growing from the soil, thick-petaled, waxy, white as enamel. People began doing the same. Soon, fields dotted with molars sprang up like grotesque vineyards. Some villagers claimed the flowers bloomed in time with the toothaches of the living. Others said they could hear the flowers whisper if the wind blew just right. Willem visited one of these gardens once. He walked between the rows, hands behind his back, eyes narrowed. He didn't smile, but he did pocket a petal that had fallen beside a child's incisor. He kept it in a jar by his bedside, and it never browned. And still, the rituals grew. Patients came with requests scrawled on parchment, sometimes smeared with wax seals, sometimes pressed with the prints of children's fingers. They asked for Willem to whisper names before the pull, to light tallow candles shaped like teeth, to drip a single drop of blood onto their palm and mark it with the sign of the cross. Willem didn't always agree, but he never outright refused. Pain had a way of making every belief feel urgent. He once removed a tooth beneath the light of a total eclipse, surrounded by 13 villagers chanting in a language he didn't know. The tooth came out cleanly. The patient died the next day. His widow claimed he'd ascended beyond mouth and bone. Willem claimed he'd choked on a chicken bone. Even the tools took on meaning. The pelican was considered sacred, a symbol of judgment. The tooth key, a relic of transition. The scraper, an agent of penance. One grinder claimed he saw the reflection of his own sins in the curved blade of a spoon excavator. Willem encouraged none of this, but neither did he discourage it. He simply kept pulling. There are limits to what the human mouth can endure. Molars can be cracked, canines yanked, roots split with rusted iron, and still the body presses on, bleeding, yes, but alive. Yet somewhere past the 12th extraction, somewhere beneath the final infected socket and the last nerve-shredding scream, there lies a tipping point, a place where pain is no longer a sensation, but a principle, and principles have a way of turning into rebellion. It began, as most insurrections do, in whispers. Willem Krantz had been working longer hours than ever. The Guild of Grinders had expanded across counties. His cellar never emptied. His ledger had 2 columns now, teeth taken and teeth promised. The former was always longer, but the latter grew bolder by the week. One patient, an old baker with only 2 teeth left, had looked him dead in the eye and said, "You keep taking. When do we get something back?" Willem laughed at the time, a coarse, phlegmy chuckle that ended in a sniff and a snapped glove. But later that night, as he scrubbed blood from his pelican, the words returned. When do we get something back? A foolish question, of course. There was no getting back. This was pain's domain. Payment enough was survival. But the sentiment festered. Soon after, a villager named Tommel refused to open his mouth, claimed he'd rather let the rot consume him than give Willem another souvenir. Willem tried to reason with him. He even offered a discount. Tommel spat on the floor and walked out. 2 days later, his cousin arrived at the cellar with a note pinned to his cloak. "We are not your harvest." Willem burned the note. But he didn't sleep well that night. More followed. A woman refused to pay after her extraction, claiming the tooth spirits had told her she'd already suffered enough. A farmer punched a grinder in the jaw for pulling the wrong tooth. Children began painting crude red doors on barns and scribbling phrases like, "Down with the pullers," in soot. Willem's name became less of a legend and more of a warning. The real turning point came when they stole the cabinet. It was a stormy night. Willem had just finished with a nobleman's daughter who'd requested the entire ritual package: candle, chant, clove smoke, and a coin kissed for luck. She fainted halfway through. By the time Willem returned upstairs, he found his cabinet of tools. Gone. Just gone. No broken locks. No forced entry. Only muddy footprints, the faint scent of sweat and soot, and the chilling realization that someone had dared to lay their hands on the sacred implements of pain. He didn't speak for 2 days. Not a word. He sat in his cellar, staring at the empty corner where the cabinet had stood for over a decade. The pelican, the key, the scraper, the drill, gone. He used a kitchen knife for the next 4 extractions. The results were unsatisfactory. On the 3rd day, a child knocked on the red door. No older than 9. Dirt on his face. Holding a box. Willem opened it and saw his pelican inside. Bent, cracked, one hinge jammed with what looked like honey. There was a note. "You've taken enough. Now it's our turn." It was signed with a symbol, a crude drawing of a molar, with a line slashed through it. The revolt had begun. They called themselves the Jingaval Guard. No one knew who started it. No one claimed leadership. But they were organized. Patients stopped showing up. Grinders reported vandalism. Tools went missing. A grinder in Brashford was found strapped to his own chair, mouth stuffed with mint leaves. Leaflets began to circulate, smuggled in bread loaves, tucked into hymnals, etched into tree bark. Teeth are not currency. We are more than enamel. Down with the blood merchants. Willem, of course, responded as only he could. He sharpened everything. He reinforced his cabinet with iron rivets, set bear traps by the door, and began sleeping in the chair, clutching the scraper like a dagger. But even he could not operate alone forever. The guild faltered. Members abandoned their posts. One tried to defect to the Gentle Jaw Clinic 2 towns over and was found floating in a vat of cordial. Another simply vanished, leaving behind only a bag of extracted molars, arranged in the shape of a question mark. Then came the night of the straps. Willem remembered it with clarity. It was late. A storm was crawling across the valley. He had just finished sewing a new leather strap when the first rock shattered the upper window. He moved quickly, too quickly. By the time he reached the cellar stairs, the door burst inward. They poured in, dozens of them, faces painted with charcoal, mouths bound with cloth. Some carried torches, others had sticks, ropes, rusty farm tools. A few held nothing but clenched fists and old bills. They didn't shout. They didn't chant. They simply moved forward. Willem stood his ground. "You want a tooth?" he barked. "I'll give you one, but it won't be yours." He lunged at the first intruder, blade flashing. He was strong. He was fast. But he was alone. The straps he had spent years using on others were used on him. They forced him into the chair. They tied him down with ritualistic precision. They removed his mask. They took his boots. Then they brought out his own tools. The pelican was broken. The tooth key rusted. The drill, to his surprise, had been polished. A woman stepped forward. Gret, the widow with the empty eyes. She'd survived more extractions than anyone. Her mouth was a battlefield. She spoke softly. "One tooth. That's all." He didn't scream. Of course he didn't. They didn't kill him. That was the genius of it. They left him intact. Just wounded. Just humbled. Before they left, they gave him a gift. A single molar. His own. Wrapped in a square of linen, bearing a stitched message. Even the harvest must bleed. When the sun rose, the chair was empty. Willem sat beside it, hands trembling, breath ragged. The cellar was a mess. Tools scattered. Ritual candles melted down to wax puddles. His cabinet door hung open, like a broken jaw. He stared at the tooth for a long time. Then he placed it in a jar, labeled it "mine," and got back to work. The uprising didn't end that day, but something shifted. The guard retreated into stories. They became ghosts again. Rumors, warnings. Patients trickled back, slowly, carefully. The rituals returned. The candles, the coins, the chants. But now they came with questions. Do you still use straps? Is it true you lost one of your own? Are you the same man? Willem would smile, just barely, and say, no. Then he'd open the cabinet, retrieve the drill, and begin again. But every so often, late at night, when the wind moaned through the cellar beams and the pelican squeaked just right, he'd glance toward the jar labeled "mine," and he would remember. Even pain has limits. Even mouths can bite back. The world outside the red door did not stop spinning. Empires crumbled. New kings were crowned. The plague whispered its final sigh, retreating into the soil like a worm seeking rest. Children grew into men. Men grew into stories. And yet, Willem Krantz remained exactly where he'd always been, beneath the creaking beams of his cellar, seated beside a chair that had swallowed more screams than the confessional booth 2 streets over. His hair had thinned. His hands had begun to tremble, slightly, but unmistakably. The pelican no longer fit his grip quite right. The drill bit stuck more often than it turned, but still he worked. Still he pulled. He no longer kept track of the number. The teeth blurred together after the 10,000th. They came in all shapes, all colors, all stages of decay. He tossed most into the fire now, only the unique ones. Spiraled roots, blackened gems, split like tiny geodes, earned a place in his final jar. That jar was full, sealed, labeled in smudged ink. End of collection. Willem had not taken an apprentice since Len. The Guild of Grinders had gone quiet. The Gentle Jaw Clinic closed after its founder vanished during a midnight stroll by the marsh. No one mourned him. The red door remained, and so did the patients. But something was changing. Willem could feel it. It began with the birds. For years, crows had perched along the roof of his home, cawing their judgment as he worked. Now they were gone. No flutter of wings. No black shapes on the fence post. Just silence. Then the dreams. He saw teeth sprouting from his fingers. He saw a chair, empty and spinning slowly in a pool of cordial. He saw the pelican, rusted shut, floating in a river of molars. Always the same ending. A man in robes, face hidden, standing over him with an ivory crown in his hands. The final omen came as a knock. It was soft, deliberate, rhythmic. Willem answered the door, expecting another farmer, another cracked jaw, another desperate plea. But it was him, the man from the dream. Tall, pale, dressed in robes, too clean for travel and too old for fashion. His eyes were gray, not dull, but heavy, like stone that had seen too much of the sea. His hands were gloved. His teeth, when he smiled, were perfect. "Are you Willem Krantz?" the man asked. Willem nodded. His tongue was suddenly dry. "I need a tooth removed," the man said. Willem opened the door wider. "You're far from wherever you came from." The man stepped inside. "I was always meant to end up here." The cellar was quiet. The tools had been laid out, as always. Ritual candle, cordial bottle, clean linen, the pelican, the chair. Willem gestured. "Sit then." The man did. No hesitation. He placed his hands on the armrests, palms open. No shaking, no questions. Just a nod. "Upper left molar," he said. Willem leaned in, looked. The tooth was pristine. No decay, no chip, white as frost. "You don't need this pulled," Willem muttered. "I do." "Why?" The man smiled. "Because that's how your story ends." Willem paused. For the first time in decades, he hesitated. He stared at the pelican, at the straps, at the familiar scent of clove oil and blood in the wood. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head. "A patient." "That's not what I asked." The man looked around the cellar, taking it in as if cataloging a museum exhibit. "You have done your work. You've pulled the pain from this village, this valley, this world. You've taken more than most men could ever carry. And now, you must let go." Willem felt a chill crawl up his spine. He reached for the pelican. His fingers trembled. The iron felt heavier than usual. He positioned it inside the stranger's mouth, adjusted the angle. The man looked him in the eyes. No screaming, no ritual. Just finish it. Willem squeezed. There was resistance, as always. A crunch, a soft, slick release. The tooth came free, but it didn't fall into the bowl. It vanished, gone, from forceps to air. Willem blinked, looked down. The chair was empty. The cellar was dark. Only the candle remained, flickering beside an unopened bottle of cordial. He stood slowly. His knees popped. His back ached. The jar labeled "End of Collection" had been moved. Now it sat in the middle of the floor, cracked, teeth scattered around it in a perfect circle. And in its place, a single note. It read, "Your hands may rest. The ache is elsewhere now." He sat in the chair, just for a moment, just to breathe. But the air was different. The cellar smelled like dust and cloves and endings, and far above, The red door creaked open. Though no one stood outside, Willem closed his eyes, and for the first time since his first extraction, he dreamed without teeth, and the chair was finally still.